Hello and welcome to our podcast. Today we will discuss global supply chains, their fragmentation, and how the African continent can exploit its wealth in mineral resources to be better integrated into these fragmented supply chains. To help me navigate these issues, today we have Dr. Cullen Hendrix from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And my first question to you, Cullen, would be regarding globalization. That's where we start. It has defined for the past decades the growth of the world economy. Now more and more institutions such as the IMF and World Bank warn about fragmentation. So what do they mean by that?
Great question. So geoeconomic fragmentation, you can think of it in one way as a return to the past. That is the status quo that obtained before the end of the Cold War and the decline in major power competition that had defined much of the 20th century. The end of the Cold War opened up space for the integration of global markets for goods, for investment, that was dominated by a logic that was making preeminent concerns about economic efficiency. So producing at the lowest possible cost to provide the greatest benefit in terms of social surplus, if you will, to consumers. That was a logic that was permitted by the decline of great power competition. What we are seeing now under geoeconomic fragmentation is a return to a context where security concerns and other domestic concerns related to, say, employment or income inequality within countries that has been increasing as a function of globalization, even as income inequality across countries has been declining. We're seeing in the major economies, not just in the United States, but also in Europe and in East Asia for that matter, a return of concerns about national security, trumping the logic of economic efficiency that had been driving globalization for the past 3 decades.
Are there any other reasons for fragmentation?
Well, yes. So I think that the core reason really has been the meteoric economic rise of China. China undoubtedly is the country that has benefited most from the experiment in globalization that has occurred over the last 30 years. Because of the size of its home market and its scale, because of domestic reforms that allowed for robust domestic economic competition, you had the creation of a very vibrant and large market that could produce at extremely low costs. And these low costs had fairly significant impact on employment in the major advanced economies, particularly in the United States, but also in Europe as well. And as what has become to be known as the China shock kind of propagated through the system, it started to create, I think, a real movement against globalization as a project, which we see kind of most pointedly in the rise of more nationalist, both in terms of economic policy, but also in terms of national security policy, kind of trends among the electorate, which have been picked up on by the political elites in these countries, that is pulling back in the direction of trying to recreate global supply chains in ways that safeguard countries' national security interests, as opposed to just being driven by the lowest cost kind of logic that obtained before.
With fragmentation in the background and having climate change in mind, how does Africa contribute to the global supply chains when we talk about the green transition?
So Africa, as I think we all know, has incredibly vast mineral resources. And the fact that we are moving beyond the hydrocarbon era, of which many African countries, Nigeria, Algeria, Angola, several others, have been big contributors to the hydrocarbon era in terms of supplying raw materials necessary to fuel the global economy. Africa is now in a position to be playing a very similar type of role as we transition to a green economy, which is going to push to the forefront concerns about supplies of materials like lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, bauxite, which is the key input for making aluminium. These are all resources that Africa has in significant quantities. And heretofore, kind of Africa had been primarily oriented around the sort of the beginnings of these supply chains as a location for the mining of these goods, for then their export for refining and then turning into sort of usable industrial inputs in other places. And so I think that what Africa sees now is an opportunity to move beyond its kind of traditional role as a source of raw materials for the global economy, and actually begin to fuel its own ambitions towards industrialization by moving beyond being a supplier of raw materials into what are referred to as downstream activities. So in particular, mineral processing.
When we talk about downstreaming for Africa, or in other words, moving up in the supply chains, the benefits are quite clear. What do you think are the main challenges and risks?
Well, so mining itself is a relatively energy-intensive activity, but it pales in comparison to the next steps in the value chain for these kinds of raw materials, which is their processing. So you're talking about a 2 order of magnitude increase in terms of the energy that's necessary to extract a metric ton of cobalt versus the kind of energy that is needed to turn that into a refined product that can be used by energy. And as I think most of us are aware, Africa as a continent is the world region that has the most significant energy deficits, where over half of the population in many countries has no access to electricity in their homes. So finding a sustainable source of energy to power this kind of industrial development is going to be a challenge. Now, the good news is that Africa, because of its land endowments, has very significant and abundant resources for renewable energy itself. It has vast river systems for hydropower, obviously the solar potential of a continent, that has a third of its territory dominated by desert is going to be significant as well. So there are solutions to that kind of challenge. Another one of the challenges that we face is workforce development. So moving past the mining industry into some of these downstream activities requires significant expertise in chemistry and metallurgy and a variety of types of technical training where there are significant skills gaps in Africa. That's not to say that Africa does not produce world-class metallurgists or chemists. It's just that most of the time, once those individuals are educated, they choose to apply their craft in other places in the world where they can earn larger incomes, or if they stay on the continent, they might be attracted to South Africa, which has kind of the most industrialized mining sector.
In your own research, you pay a lot of attention to regional cooperation. So what would that mean for Africa in the context of supply chains?
That's a great question. So what I was talking about earlier with these trends towards geoeconomic fragmentation, this is being driven by the actions and the policies of major large economies that have significant scale. So thinking about it in terms of the actions of the United States, or the actions of China, or the actions of the European Union. Most African countries do not have anywhere near the size of kind of home market that would be necessary to sustain a very nationalist kind of economic sort of policy. Now, the good news is that against a backdrop of increasing geoeconomic fragmentation, Africa is moving in a different direction. Africa is moving towards more regional-based integration around the African continental free trade area, which I think is going to facilitate a lot of cooperative investment, but also the creation of value chains for these kinds of raw materials that will span borders. And that actually situates a country like Morocco in a pretty advantageous position, in particular as a sort of a jumping off point for supply chains for critical minerals to receive additional processing in a place like Morocco, which already has significant industrial capacity, and especially in rock phosphate and downstream industries from that, has significant industrial capacity to be able to compete effectively at the global scale in order to provide these kind of processed materials for the industrial bases of these other poles of the major global economy.
So for Morocco and Africa more generally, looking into the next decade and the trend toward fragmentation, how can these countries best leverage their potential?
Well, I think that the move towards renewable energy systems globally and the move towards decarbonization actually puts Africa in an advantageous position, because Africa has some of the largest exportable endowments of many of these materials. And Africa is not, or is even if accepting the premise that it at previous points in history was sort of had its economic fortunes wedded to, say, Europe. Or increasingly, there's talk about Chinese penetration in the African market. And the US obviously has interests in developing stronger ties with African economies for a variety of reasons, not just around these kind of critical renewable energy related metals. I think that Africa's, if I were in that position, I would say this is a very advantageous point from which to be able to command kind of the best possible set of circumstances and be able to dictate some of the terms of engagement for major multinationals that would like to invest here. Because there are clearly going to be other suitors knocking to the door that would like to be able to take advantage of these kind of raw materials. And so I think that African states will be in a good negotiating position that will only be strengthened by them acting collectively in accordance with sort of these aspirations for greater regional coordination and integration.
Morocco is the only country of the continent that has a free trade agreement with the US. So how do you see the future of this agreement?
Well, I think that's particularly important if Africa as a continent wants to take advantage of some of the opportunities that have been created by this landmark piece of legislation in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, which, despite its name, is very much a climate mitigation act. It is intended to provide sticker price is about $368 billion. At the end of the day, the total outlays of government spending in the US is likely to be on the order of $1 trillion of subsidies and tax incentives for the production of renewable energy. The caveat there is that the Inflation Reduction Act was written in such a way that the only countries that can take advantage of these kinds of subsidies and beneficial tax treatment are those that have a free trade agreement with the United States. And as you point out, Morocco is the only country on the continent that has a free trade agreement with the United States, which makes it an ideal hub for these kind of processing activities that then can be exported into the United States and take advantage of at least 50% of the tax credits that are available for adoption of, say, electric vehicles. So this is a very advantageous position, assuming that Morocco has a plan for developing renewable energy inputs so that we're not contributing to the climate problem by pinning our hopes for a renewable energy future on the consumption of further fossil fuels.
Cullen, thank you very much for your insights today.
My pleasure.
So how can African countries reap the benefits of integration, downstreaming, and regional cooperation without compromising their policy autonomy and ultimately sovereignty? This is the question that we have to answer.